Hello and welcome back to the Ash and Stone channel. My name is Chris and today we're going to have a look at the Wartnose Jouster models for Hairfoot Jousting. We'll have a look at each of the models in the set and I'll show you how I went about painting one of them. Looking at the raw model and a painted example side by side, we'll start with our jouster on a porcupine. He's definitely one of the better equipped goblins with helmet and breastplate, and he's even got a van plate for his lance. I was dreading having to paint these stripes on the quills as I was getting closer to finishing the models, but actually it wasn't too bad at all. Next up is a centipede rider, tall in the saddle with his spear held high. He's one of the only goblins to have hair. He'll be relying on his agility to avoid incoming lances, as beyond a pair of greaves, he's going in unencumbered. The Toad Rider is next, and he is one of my favourites. Slumped down in a manner reminiscent of the toad he rides, the poor buggers come to the joust with a wonky stick and a little cap, looking fresh from the swamp he calls home. Now we'll look at the Mole Rat Rider. Oh boy, this one was the most unpleasant to paint by far, if only because it forced me to look up reference pictures of naked mole rats. Of all of the creatures here, they are the most repulsive to look at. The rider has a great big toadstool cap on his head, and in addition to having a sharp rock lashed to his stick, he sports a wooden shield and sandwich board armour. The Cockroach is next, and I reckon I'll be skirting YouTube's terms of service here. Naked mole rats and cockroaches? Oh my. Its rider sits in a bucket and wields a mighty volge in both hands. He's got a wooden mask on his head, though how he would wear it over his face with that big honkin' nose is a mystery to me. And finally we have the Rat Rider, trident held high in the air with his rat skull helmet on and a shield and wrapped on belly plate. He's ready to sound the charge. Cleanup of the models wasn't bad. I did have to give them a second go over once the primer was down and it highlighted the mould lines, but nothing major there. But enough about that, let's show you how I painted the Rat Rider. First of all, I've put them all on 30mm bases, because I'm a contrarian and I just wanted the play area to be smaller. I used custom made 3D printed bases that I designed to account for the puddles on the bottom of the miniatures. You glue your miniature into the recess and then use a bit of filler to smooth things out, making the top of the puddle flush with the edge of the base. I use these for anything with a puddle nowadays, they just make things so easy. So if you want the files, you can find them for free at the link in the description. I hit the model with an Army Painter Ash Grey primer, which gives me a light grey base to work off. I'm going to start with painting the rat, and I get a bit of Vallejo Sky Grey, Chocolate Brown and US Grey ready to go on my wet palette. I'm going to be doing some very rough wet blending, so I want to have the paints ready to go. If you have never done wet blending before, something like this is a great place to experiment. Because most of it will be covered up, it doesn't matter if things don't go well. I slather the Sky Grey onto the bottom half of the rat, and while it is still wet, mix the brown and US Grey together. This makes the brown desaturated rather than being quite so strong. This mix gets roughly slapped onto the top of the rat. Then with a clean damp brush, I simply mix the two wet paints together on the model, blending the colours together. If I feel I need a little more brown or grey, I can simply grab it from the palette and work the colours together until I'm happy. This gives us the light undertone to the rat's fur, and it need not be perfect. As I said earlier, most of it will be covered. Though perhaps not strictly necessary, once that has dried I go in with a bit of sponge and add more of the brown mix to the lower half of the model. Using the sponge helps to make a more random pattern, and it keeps the light grey down in the recesses. That's the undertone of the fur done, and on top of that I'm going to add black. I use the same sponge technique, working it from the top of the model down its sides, sponging on until I'm happy. The somewhat random application of paint from the sponge does a couple of things. It leaves random spots of the undertone in among the black. It gives us a fairly random transition from black to the lighter tones of the legs and belly of the rat. And it tends to catch the high points of those areas, like the fur strands, leaving the light undertone in the recesses. It does need to be tidied up, however. Areas like the saddle prevent the sponge from getting in there, so I go in with a brush to make sure the back of the model is black, and to tidy up any other areas that I think warrant it. The final step for the fur is to give it a dry brush of Vallejo Black Grey. This gives us a highlight for all of the areas of black, and I work it down the legs and sides a little to catch the higher strands of hair. Once again, broken record, leaving the light undertone in the recesses. It looks very messy at the moment, but we have to trust the process. Once the details and matte varnish are on, everything should come together. Speaking of details, Vallejo Basic Skin Tone is used to pick out the areas of exposed skin. The nose, the eyes, the ears, the paws, and the tail. It takes a couple of coats to get a good consistent finish, and once that's dry, it gets hit with a wash of Army Painter Flesh Wash to shade the details. Except for the tail. That gets hit with a wash of Army Painter Soft Tone to give it more of a browny yellow tone. When the wash has dried, I go back in and hit the high points of the ears and nose with Basic Skin Tone to highlight them. Black is used to pick out the rat's eyes. And I use a little off-white to pick out the teeth, which are then shaded using soft tone. I also decide that while a shiny black is technically correct for a rat's eyes, I want to paint in whites like a human eye, because it cartoonizes it a bit and it fits the vibe. Time to work on the goblin, and I start with a couple of coats of Vallejo Light Grey Green over all of the areas of skin. I'm liking this more desaturated green as my orc and goblin skin tone over a more classical bright green, as it just feels a bit more grounded to me. I know, cartoon eyes, goblins riding giant insects, and you want a grounded skin tone? What can I say, it just works for me. When that is dried, I hit the skin with a coat of Army Painter Speed Paint Gravelord Grey. This gives us a nice dark shading in the recesses, and a darker base to the rest of the skin from which to work. Then I can go back in with the light grey green and hit the higher areas, leaving the shading in the dark recesses. A further highlight is applied by mixing a spot of Vallejo Silver Grey in with the light green grey. It doesn't take much, and this gets applied on the highest points and the details of the face to make things pop. For some of the figures, I like to make the end of the nose slightly redder. A bulbous red nose just strikes me as amusing, so I mix in a touch of Vallejo Brown Rose into that earlier highlight, shifting the tone from green-grey towards red, and this gets applied to the end of the nose like a highlight and helps to make it stick out from the rest of the face. Ha! Let's finish off the face by doing the eyes and teeth. The eyes are painted in black before the whites of the eyes and teeth are picked out with, well, white. This footage is sped up so we don't waste so much of your time, but if you are going to do this, take it at your own pace and make sure you brace your hands as best you can. That's our skin and face done, so I move on to the wood and leather, giving each a base coat of Vallejo Chocolate Brown. Picking the tack out around the head of the rat goes a long way towards making me happy about the paint job there. I was a little worried at this point, but trust the process. The leather gets a rough highlight of Vallejo Flat Earth. I say highlight but really it's intended to pick out the areas where the leather has been worn and scratched rather than a highlight in the traditional sense, so it's more roughly and unevenly applied. Vallejo Beige Brown is used to highlight the areas of wood, the shield and the spear shaft, picking out the sculpted wood grain. This also does not need to be particularly tidy or accurate. And Vallejo Dark Sand is used on the leather to pick out the areas of most wear, where it's been worn through the top dyed layers to the raw leather beneath. It's put on along the edge of the saddle and as scratches and spots along the tack. The wood and leather is then finished off with a wash of Army Painter Strong Tone. This shades out areas of brown, helping the details to stand out, especially that wood grain, and helps to tie the disparate tones on the leather together. Next up, I grab some Vallejo Iraqi sand and put a couple of coats down on the loincloth and rat skull helmet. And this is followed up with a wash of Army Painter Soft Tone, making sure to get good coverage in the recesses, such as the eye sockets. While I wait for that to dry, I use a little black to base the areas that will be steel, as the metallic paint will have a much better finish over black than light grey. By this time the wash has dried and I can reapply the base colour of Iraqi sand to the loincloth and the skull, leaving the wash to darken the recesses. Mixing in a little off-white gives me a highlight which I can use along the edge of the loincloth, and I apply it as a scratchy highlight to the skull. What I mean by this is that instead of highlighting the whole edge of the eye socket, like you normally would, I instead use lots of dabs, dots and slashes, highlighting in a somewhat random fashion. This leaves us with a worn, battered and textured feel on the bone, rather than a crisp, clean finish. This is especially effective on the top of the skull, which is normally quite even and smooth, but those scratchy highlights give it a little something extra. I also paint the teeth with this mix. Finally, I use pure off-white to highlight the teeth, and then to add some more extreme highlights to the skull, once again doing so in a scratchy, uneven fashion. Now for the rawhide and wraps. I grab the Vallejo German Camouflage Beige and give the shield rim and the wraps around the model's limbs and belly a couple of coats to make sure I've got a nice even finish. This is followed by a wash of dark tone to shade these areas. I use dark tone on the beige rather than a strong or soft tone because the beige has quite a bit of green in it, and a brown wash just makes it look really off. The black wash looks much better. It also has the advantage of setting the camo beige further apart from the Iraqi sand, despite them both being similar colours. While I wait for that wash to dry, I grab some Vallejo Royal Purple to add a splash of colour to the miniature. This is painted on the Goblin's collar, and I do the wrap around the trident as well. In general, I've tried to stick to fairly dark and desaturated tones on the Goblin, but it's nice to get a little pop of colour in there. By this time our dark tone has dried and I can go back in with the German Camo Beige and highlight the shield rim and the edges of the wraps. Army Painter Purple Tone is used to shade the purple areas. Ideally, with time in mind, you would do this before the beige highlight, but I was still waiting on the purple base to dry. Once that wash is ready, I can reapply Royal Purple, leaving the wash down as a shade in the recesses, and then a little Vallejo Blue Violet is used for the extreme highlights, just catching the edges of the collar and the weapon wrap. Almost there. I hit the areas of metal with a coat of Vallejo Natural Steel. This is a fairly dark and transparent metallic, so the black base we put down tends to show through. In order to make the metal even rougher, I give it a coat of Army Painter Speed Paint Grim Black. This does a great job of blackening the steel, giving it a look as if it's been used pretty much straight from the forge without any polishing or cleanup. When that's dry, the whole model is given a blast of Tamiya Flat Clear to seal and protect the paint and remove any unwanted shine. This is where the rat finally comes together. I was a little bit worried, but the flat spray pulls it all together, evening out the different lusters and giving me the finish I was hoping for. Trust the process. With everything now flat, we need to add a little metallic shine back in a few areas. So I go back in with the natural steel, hitting the edges of the steel that have been sharpened or scratched, where the black oxide layer from the forge has been worn through. A little AK Interactive light rust will finish that steel off. Adding a little to the recesses between the tines of the trident will further hint that this weapon isn't particularly well looked after. That is the model itself complete, so now let's have a look at the base. I want it to be barren as opposed to the lush bases of the Hairfoot Jousters, and our first step is to give the top of the base a coat of black. Then we get to play with crackle paint. I use Citadel Agrelin Earth and slather it all over the base. You want to be quite generous with the application and put it on fairly thick, as the thicker it goes on, the more impressive the cracking when it dries. It is a little bit of a pig to work with, but just take your time. You want to try and get a reasonable layer over all of the ground, but also avoid coating the miniature with your loaded brush. So, fun and games. Then we just leave it to thoroughly dry. This little time lapse is over the course of about 4 hours, and you can see the crackle paint working its magic. I leave it overnight to make sure that it is fully dry, and this is what we come back to in the morning. It has cracked very nicely, though it's exposed a little bit of the white filler in the gaps, but this isn't an issue. We'll be covering this up in the next step anyway. I grabbed some strong tone and a little Liquitex Flow Aid. I mix the wash about 50-50 with water to thin it a bit, and then add a brush of Flow Aid to ensure the wash will spend more time moving deep into the cracks and less time blobbing up on the surface. The white filler soaks up the wash really nicely, completely hiding the stark white with ease, and the thinned wash just generally adds a shade to the cracked surface. When that has been given the time it needs to dry, I dry brush on some Army Painter Banshee Brown to pick up all the edges and add a nice dry earth highlight to the cracked mud, really making it pop. The edge of the base is given 2 coats of black to tidy it up and frame the model, and then I add a couple of small homemade grass tufts to break up the monotone of the earth and add a little more to the base. And that is it done. Just like the Hairfoot Jousters, these models are dripping with character and have an incredible cute but nasty vibe. When I first saw the previews, I'll admit I was not entirely sold on them. They just didn't capture me like the Hairfoot Jousters did. But they have been an absolute blast to paint, and I think they are just fantastic. The variety in the mounts has been so much fun, and the goblins themselves are just so full of character in a way that I don't think the previews captured in the same way the Hairfoot previews did. I do hope you have found this video interesting and helpful. Thank you very much for joining me, and we shall see you all next time. Cheers!